pray in your magnificent name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Morning business is closed. Morning business is closed, and the Senate will convene as a court of impeachment. I ask senators to be seated. If there is no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. I'd ask the Sergeant-at-Arms to make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the article of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
I note the presence in the Senate chamber of the managers on the part of the House Representatives and counsel for the former President of the United States.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, in a moment, I will call up a resolution to govern the structure of the second impeachment trial of Donald John Trump. It's been agreed to by the House managers, the former President's counsel, and is co-sponsored by the Republican leader. It is bipartisan. It's our solemn constitutional duty to conduct a fair and honest impeachment trial of the charges against former President Trump, the gravest charges ever brought against a President of the United States in American history. This resolution provides for a fair trial, and I urge the Senate to adopt it. Mr. President, I send a resolution to the desk on my behalf and that of the Republican leader for the organizing of the next phases of this trial.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 47, to provide for related procedures concerning the article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
The question occurs on the adoption of the resolution.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff.
All right. Thank you so
aye.
much, everybody, for joining us. We are
Padilla,
watching the
aye.
live
Mr.
proceedings and
Paul,
waste of money
no.
for the
Mr.
taxpayers and
Mr.
so on for the
Peters,
Trump
aye. Mr.
impeachment
Portman.
trial.
Mr.
Do us a
Portman,
favor, if you like what you've seen,
Aye. Mr.
please
Reed.
like, share,
Mr.
and
Reed,
subscribe. We appreciate
aye.
it.
Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, Aye. Mr. Haggerty, no.
We'd like to say thank you to everybody joining us from all other states. We are here in Arizona. We do live breaking news and events all across the Arizona area. We are based out of Gilbert, Arizona. We appreciate all your support. We have a lot of new subscribers and likers to our page. We appreciate it. We normally are out in the field going live to breaking news and events. Sometimes we bring events like this as well. We do appreciate everybody's support. If you like what you're seeing, do us a favor, like, share, and subscribe. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and currently we're streaming on Twitch as well. Thank you, everyone.
The nays are 11. The resolution is agreed to. And pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 47, there shall now be 4 hours of argument by the parties equally divided on the question of whether Donald John Trump is subject to the jurisdiction of a court of impeachment for acts committed while President of the United States, notwithstanding the expiration of his term in that office. Mr. Manager Raskin, are you a proponent or opponent of this question?
I'm a proponent.
Thank you. Mr. Castor, are you a proponent or opponent of this question?
We're an opponent.
Thank you. Then, Mr. Manager Raskin, your party may proceed first and will be able to reserve rebuttal time if you wish. Mr. Raskin, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Senate. Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Raskin. It's my honor to represent the people of Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the House and also to serve as the lead House manager. And, Mr. President, we will indeed reserve time for rebuttal. Thank you. Because I've been a professor of constitutional law for 3 decades, I know there are a lot of people who are dreading endless lectures about the Federalist Papers here. Please breathe easy, okay? I remember well W.H. Auden's line that a professor is someone who speaks while other people are sleeping. You will not be hearing extended lectures from me because our case is based on cold, hard facts. It's all about the facts. President Trump has sent his lawyers here today to try to stop the Senate from hearing the facts of this case. They want to call the trial over before any evidence is even introduced. Their argument is that if you commit an impeachable offense in your last few weeks in office, you do it with constitutional impunity. You get away with it. In other words, conduct that would be a high crime and misdemeanor in your first year as president, and your second year as president, and your third year as president, and for the vast majority of your fourth year as president, you can suddenly do in your last few weeks in office without facing any constitutional accountability at all. This would create a brand new January exception to the Constitution of the United States of America. A January exception. And everyone can see immediately why this is so dangerous. It's an invitation to the president to take his best shot at anything he may want to do on his way out the door, including using violent means to lock that door, to hang on to the Oval Office at all costs, and to block the peaceful transfer of power. In other words, the January exception is an invitation to our founders' worst nightmare. And if we buy this radical argument that President Trump's lawyers advance, we risk allowing January 6th to become our future. And what will that mean for America? Think about it. What will the January exception mean to future generations if you grant it? I'll show you.
We will stop the steal. Today I will lay out just some of the evidence proving that we won this election, and we won it by a landslide. This was not a close election. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Yeah! Let's take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. We are going to the Capitol, where our problems are. It's that direction. Everybody in! This way! This way!
Tens of thousands of votes. They came in duffel bags. Where the hell did they come from?
Madam Speaker, the Vice President, and the United States Senate.
Off the sidewalk.
Stand up for him. Stand up for him. We outnumber you 1,000,000 to 1 out here, dude.
Take the building! Take the building! Fuck these kids. Join us! That's enough! There's more coming!
The Constitution says you have to protect our country, and you have to protect our Constitution. And you can't vote on fraud. And fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do.
Talk about you,
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Fuck you, Fuck you,
So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol. And we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country.
Get the fuck out of here, you traitors!
Majority Leader.
We're debating a step that has never been taken in American history. President Trump claims the election was stolen. The assertions range from specific local allegations to constitutional arguments to sweeping conspiracy theories. But my colleagues, nothing before us proves illegality anywhere near the massive scale that would have tipped the entire election.
My challenge today is not about the good people of Arizona.
And it will stand in recess until the call of the chair.
We'll pause.
Protesters are in the building.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, can I have order in the chamber?
The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Okay.
There's gotta be something in here we can fucking use against these scumbags.
That's what we fucking need to have 30,000 guns up here. Next trip. That's what we need. Let's go! Let's go! Take it! Take it! Take it out! Use the shield! Use the shield! Use the shield! We need fresh patriots abroad!
There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace.
Counties, storm your own Capitol buildings, and take down every one of these corrupt motherfuckers. Hang up!
Senators, the president was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives on January 13th for doing that. You ask what a high crime and misdemeanor is under our Constitution? That's a high crime and misdemeanor. If that's not an impeachable offense, then there is no such thing. And if the president's arguments for a January exception are upheld, then even if everyone agrees that he's culpable for these events, even if the evidence proves, as we think it definitively does, that the president incited a violent insurrection on the day Congress met to finalize the presidential election, he would have you believe there is absolutely nothing the Senate can do about it. No trial, no facts. He wants you to decide that the Senate is powerless at that point. That can't be right. The transition of power is always the most dangerous moment for democracies. Every historian will tell you that. We just saw it in the most astonishing way. We lived through it. And you know what? The framers of our Constitution knew it. That's why they created a Constitution with an oath written into it that binds the president from his very first day in office until his very last day in office and every day in between. Under that Constitution and under that oath, the President of the United States is forbidden to commit high crimes and misdemeanors against the people at any point that he's in office. Indeed, that's one specific reason the impeachment, conviction, and disqualification powers exist, to protect us against presidents who try to overrun the power of the people in their elections and replace the rule of law with the rule of mobs. These powers must apply even if the president commits his offenses in his final weeks in office. In fact, that's precisely when we need them the most, because that's when elections get attacked. Everything that we know about the language of the Constitution, the framers' original understanding and intent, prior Senate practice, and common sense confirms this rule. Let's start with the text of the Constitution, which in Article 1, Section 2 gives the House the sole power of impeachment when the president commits high crimes and misdemeanors. We exercised that power on January 13th. The president, it is undisputed, committed his offense while he was president. And it is undisputed that we impeached him while he was president. There can be no doubt that this is a valid and legitimate impeachment. And there can be no doubt that the Senate has the power to try this impeachment. We know this because Article 1, Section 3 gives the Senate the sole power to try all impeachments. The Senate has the power, the sole power, to try all impeachments. All means all, and there are no exceptions to the rule. Because the Senate has jurisdiction to try all impeachments, it most certainly has jurisdiction to try this one. It's really that simple. The vast majority of constitutional scholars who studied the question and weighed in on the proposition being advanced by the president, this January exception, heretofore unknown, agree with us. And that includes the nation's most prominent conservative legal scholars, including former 10th Circuit Judge Michael McConnell, the co-founder of the Federalist Society, Stephen Calabresi, Ronald Reagan Solicitor General Charles Freed, luminary Washington lawyer Charles Cooper, among hundreds of other constitutional lawyers and professors. I commend the people I named, their recent writings to you in the newspapers over the last several days. And all of the key precedents, along with detailed explanation of the constitutional history and textual analysis, appear in the trial brief we filed last week and the reply brief that we filed very early this morning. I'll spare you a replay, but I want to highlight a few key points from constitutional history that strike me as compelling in foreclosing President Trump's argument that there's a secret January exception hidden away in the Constitution. The first point comes from English history, which matters because, as Hamilton wrote, England provided the model from which the idea of this institution has been borrowed. And it would have been immediately obvious to anyone familiar with that history that former officials could be held accountable for their abuses while in office. Every single impeachment of a government official that occurred during the framers' lifetime concerned a former official. A former official. Indeed, the most famous of these impeachments occurred while the framers gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution. It was the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the former Governor General of the British colony of Bengal, and a corrupt guy. The framers knew all about it, and they strongly supported the impeachment. In fact, the Hastings case was invoked by name at the convention. It was the only specific impeachment case that they discussed at the convention. It played a key role in their adoption of the high crimes and misdemeanors standard. And even though everyone there surely knew that Hastings had left office 2 years before his impeachment trial began, not a single framer, not one, raised a concern when Virginian George Mason held up the Hastings impeachment as a model for us in the writing of our Constitution. The early state constitutions supported the idea too. Every single state constitution in the 1780s either specifically said that former officials could be impeached or were entirely consistent with the idea. In contrast, not a single state constitution prohibited trials of former officials. As a result, there was an overwhelming presumption in favor of allowing legislatures to hold former officials accountable in this way. Any departure from that norm would have been a big deal, and yet there's no sign anywhere that that ever happened. Some states, including Delaware, even confined impeachment only to officials who had already left office. This confirms that removal was never seen as the exclusive purpose of impeachment in America. The goal was always about accountability, protecting society, and deterring official corruption. Delaware matters for another reason. Writing about impeachment in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton explained that the President of America would stand upon no better ground than a governor of New York and upon worse ground than the governors of Maryland and Delaware. He thus emphasized that the President is even more accountable than officials in Delaware, where, as I noted, the Constitution clearly allowed impeachment of former officials. And nobody involved in the convention ever said that the framers meant to reject this widely accepted, deeply rooted understanding of the word impeachment when they wrote it into our Constitution. The convention debates instead confirm this interpretation. There, while discussing impeachment, the framers repeatedly returned to the threat of presidential corruption aimed directly at elections, the heart of self-government. Almost perfectly anticipating President Trump, William Davey of North Carolina explained impeachment was for a president who spared, quote, no effort or means whatever to get himself reelected. Hamilton in Federalist I said the greatest danger to republics and the liberties of the people comes from political opportunists who begin as demagogues and end as tyrants, and the people who are encouraged to follow them. President Trump may not know a lot about the framers, but they certainly knew a lot about him. Given the framers' intense focus on danger to elections and the peaceful transfer of power, it is inconceivable that they designed impeachment to be a dead letter in the president's final days in office, when opportunities to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power would be most tempting and most dangerous, as we just saw. Thus, as a matter of history and original understanding, there is no merit to President Trump's claim that he can incite an insurrection and then insist weeks later that the Senate lacks the power to even hear evidence at a trial, to even hold a trial. The true rule was stated by former President John Quincy Adams when he categorically declared, I hold myself, so long as I have the breath of life in my body, amenable to impeachment by the House for everything I did during the time I held any public office. When he comes up in a minute, my colleague, Mr. Neguse of Colorado, will further pursue the relevant Senate precedents and explain why this body's practice has been supported by the text of the Constitution. And Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island will then respond to the fallacies presented by the President's counsel. And after these gentlemen speak, I will return to discuss the importance, the fundamental importance of the Senate rejecting President Trump's argument for the preservation of democratic self-government and the rule of law in the United States of America. I now will turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Neguse of Colorado.
Do I have to recognize him? No. Okay.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, my name is Joe Neguse, and I represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District. in the United States Congress. Like many of you, I'm an attorney. I practiced law before I came to Congress, tried a lot of different cases, some more unique than others. Certainly never a case as important as this one, nor a case with such a heavy and weighty constitutional question for you all to decide. Thankfully, as lead manager Raskin so thoroughly explained, the framers have answered that question for you, for us. And you don't need to be a constitutional scholar to know that the argument President Trump asks you to adopt is not just wrong, it's dangerous. And you don't have to take my word for it. This body, the world's greatest deliberative body, the United States Senate, has reached that same conclusion in one form or another over the past 200 years in multiple occasions that we'll go through. Over 150 constitutional scholars, experts, judges, conservative, liberal, you name it, they overwhelmingly have reached the same conclusion, that of course you can try, convict, and disqualify a former president. And that makes sense, because the text of the Constitution makes clear there is no January exception to the impeachment power. That presidents can't commit grave offenses in their final days and escape any congressional response. That's not how our Constitution works. Let's start with the precedent, with what has happened in this very chamber. I'd like to focus on just two cases. I'll go through them quickly. One of them is the nation's very first impeachment case, which actually was of a former official. In 1797, about a decade after our country had ratified our Constitution, there was a senator from Tennessee by the name of William Blount who was caught conspiring with the British to try to sell Florida and Louisiana. Ultimately, President Adams caught him. He turned over the evidence to Congress. 4 days later, the House of Representatives impeached him. A day after that, this body, the United States Senate, expelled him from office. So he was very much a former official. Despite that, the House went forward with its impeachment proceeding in order to disqualify him from ever again holding federal office. And so the Senate proceeded with the trial, with none other than Thomas Jefferson presiding. Now, Blount argued that the Senate couldn't proceed because he had already been expelled. But here's the interesting thing. He expressly disavowed any claim that former officials can't ever be impeached. I mean, unlike President Trump, he was very clear that he respected and understood that he could not even try to argue that ridiculous position. Even impeached Senator Blount recognized the inherent absurdity of that view. Here's what he said. "I certainly never shall contend that an officer may first commit an offense and afterwards avoid by resigning his office." That's the point. And there was no doubt, because the founders were around to confirm that that was their intent and the obvious meaning of what is in the Constitution. Fast forward 80 years later, arguably the most important precedent that this body has to consider: the trial of former Secretary of War William Belknap. I'm not going to go into all the details, but just in short, in 1876, the House discovered that he was involved in a massive kickback scheme. Hours before the House committee that discovered this conduct released its report documenting the scheme, Belknap literally rushed to the White House to resign, tender his resignation to President Ulysses Grant, to avoid any further inquiry into his misconduct, and of course, to avoid being disqualified from holding federal office in the future. Well, later that day, aware of the resignation, what did the House do? The House moved forward and unanimously impeached him, making clear its power to impeach a former official. And when his case reached the Senate, this body, Belknap made the exact same argument that President Trump is making today, that you all lack jurisdiction, any power to try him because he's a former official. Now, many senators at that time, when they heard that argument, literally they were sitting in the same chairs you all are sitting in today. They were outraged by that argument. Outraged. You can read their comments in the record. They knew it was a dangerous, dangerous argument with dangerous implications. It would literally mean that a president could betray their country, leave office, and avoid impeachment and disqualification entirely. And that's why, in the end, the United States Senate decisively voted that the Constitution required them to proceed with the trial. The Belknap case is clear precedent that the Senate must proceed with this trial since it rejected pretrial dismissal, affirmed its jurisdiction, and moved to a full consideration of the merits. Now, Belknap ultimately was not convicted, but only after a thorough public inquiry into his misconduct, which created a record of his wrongdoing. It ensured his accountability and deterred anyone else from considering such corruption by making clear that it was intolerable. The trial served important constitutional purposes. Now, given that precedent that I've described to you, given all that that precedent imparts, you could imagine my surprise, Lead Manager Raskin's surprise, when we were reviewing the trial brief filed by the president, in which his counsel insists that the Senate actually didn't decide anything in the Belknap case. They say, these are not my words, I'll quote from their trial brief, it cannot be read as foreclosing an argument that they never dealt with. Never dealt with? The Senate didn't debate this question for 2 hours. The Senate debated this very question for 2 weeks. The Senate spent an additional 2 weeks deliberating on the jurisdictional question. And at the end of those deliberations, they decided decisively that the Senate has jurisdiction and that it could proceed, that it must proceed to a full trial. And by the way, unlike Belknap, as we know, President Trump was not impeached for run-of-the-mill corruption, misconduct. He was impeached for inciting a violent insurrection. An insurrection where people died in this building. An insurrection that desecrated our seat of government. And if Congress were just to stand completely aside in the face of such an extraordinary crime against the Republic, it would invite future presidents to use their power without any fear of accountability. And none of us, I know this, none of us, no matter our party or our politics, wants that. Now, we've gone through the highlights of the precedent, and I think it's important that you know, as Lead Manager Raskin mentioned, that scholars overwhelmingly who have reviewed this same precedent have all come to the same conclusion, that the Senate must hear this case. Let's go through just a few short examples. To start, all of us, I know, are familiar with the Federalist Society. Some of you may know Stephen Calabrese personally. He's the co-founder of the Federalist Society. He actually was the chairman of the board in 2019. He was the first president of the Yale Federalist Society chapter board, a position that I understand Senator Hawley later held. Here is what Mr. Calabrese has to say. On January 21st, he issued a public letter, stating, "Our carefully considered views of the law lead all of us to agree that the Constitution permits the impeachment, conviction, and disqualification of former officers, including presidents." And by the way, he's not the only one. As Lead Manager Raskin said, President Reagan's former Solicitor General, among many others. Another prominent conservative scholar, known to many of you, again personally, is former 10th Circuit Court of Appeals judge, my circuit, Judge Michael McConnell. He was nominated by President George W. Bush He was confirmed by this body unanimously. Senator Hatch, many of you served with, he had this to say about Judge McConnell, that he's an honest man. He calls it as he sees it, and he's beholden to no one and no group. Well, what does Judge McConnell have to say about the question that you're debating this afternoon? He said the following: given the impeachment of Mr. Trump was legitimate, the text makes clear that the Senate has power to try that impeachment. You heard Lead Manager Raskin mention another lawyer, Chuck Cooper, who's a prominent conservative lawyer here in Washington, has represented former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. He issued an editorial just 2 days ago, very powerful, observing that scholarship in this question has matured substantially, and that ultimately the arguments that President Trump is championing are beset by serious weaknesses. Finally, we've gone through a lot of scholars. I'll finish on this one. There's another scholar that I know some of you know, and some of you have actually spoken with recently. Up until just a few weeks ago, he was a recognized champion of the view that the Constitution authorizes the impeachment of former officials, and that is Professor Jonathan Turley. Let me show you what I mean. These are his words. First, in a very detailed study, thorough study, he explained that, quote, the resignation from office does not prevent trial on articles of impeachment. That's Professor Turley's words. Same piece, he celebrated the Belknap trial. He described it as a corrective measure that helped the system regain legitimacy. He wrote another article. He's written several on this topic. This one is actually, it's a 146-page study, very detailed. And in that study, he said, quote, that the decision in Belknap was correct in its view that impeachment historically had extended to former officials, such as Warren Hastings, who you heard Lead Manager Raskin describe. In fact, as you can see, Professor Turley argued that the House could have impeached and the Senate could have tried Richard Nixon after he resigned. His quote on this, very telling, quote, future presidents could not assume that mere resignation would avoid a trial of their conduct in the United States Senate. Finally, last quote from Professor Turley, that no man in no circumstance can escape the account which he owes to the laws of his country. Not my words, not Lead Manager Raskin's words, Professor Jonathan Turley's words. I agree with him because he's exactly right. Now, a question one might reasonably ask after going through all those quotes from such noted jurists and scholars is, why is there such agreement on this topic? Well, the reason's pretty simple. Because it's what the Constitution says. I want to walk you through 3 provisions of the Constitution that make clear that the Senate must try this case. First, let's start with what the Constitution says about Congress's power in Article 1. You heard Lead Manager Raskin make this point, but it's worth underscoring. Article 1, Section 2 gives the House the sole power of impeachment. Article 1, Section 3 gives the Senate the sole power to try all impeachments. Now, based on President Trump's argument, one would think that language includes caveats, exceptions, but it doesn't. It doesn't say impeachment of current civil officers. It doesn't say impeachment of those still in office. The framers didn't mince words. They provided express, absolute, unqualified grants of jurisdictional power to the House to impeach and to the Senate to try all impeachments. Not some, all. Former Judge McConnell, judge that we talked about earlier, he provides a very effective textual analysis of this provision. You can see it up here on the slide. And I'll just give you the highlight. He says, and I'll quote, this is Judge McConnell, given that the impeachment of Mr. Trump was legitimate, the text makes clear that the Senate has power to try that impeachment. Now, again, here is what is pretty interesting, me at least. When we presented this argument in our trial brief, which we filed over a week ago, well, we laid it out again, step by step, so that you could consider it and so that opposing counsel could consider it as well. We received President Trump's response yesterday, and the trial brief offers no rebuttal to this point. None. And in fairness, I can't think of any convincing response. I mean, the Constitution is just exceptionally clear on this point. Now, perhaps they will have something to say today about it, but they did not yesterday. There's another provision worth mentioning here because there's been a lot of confusion about it, and I'm going to try to clear this up. This is the provision on removal and disqualification. Now, we all know the Senate imposes a judgment only when it convicts. Up on the screen, you'll see Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7. So with that in mind, the language says that the Senate convicts, the judgment shall not extend further than removal and disqualification. That's it. The meaning is clear. The Senate has the power to impose removal, which only applies to